What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is your boy Frankie Bones, and in today's video, I know it's been a little while, but we're going to hop back into the Call of Duty League. We are going to talk about some Rostermania updates. A couple weeks after everything sort of started, players have started to sign, and things are really starting to pick up as we head into the next season. We'll talk obviously about all the official roster moves that were made. We'll talk a little bit about some of the moves that other teams might be able to make and maybe the direction they may be heading, as well as highlighting some of the key players that are still left and able to be picked up by teams to help build rosters to compete with these top four. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure to drop a like, as well as subscribe to not miss any Call of Duty content coming in the future, as well as Call of Duty League content once the season starts back up, probably in around December or so. The first team that we're going to talk about here is the team that I support, obviously OpTic Texas. They make a couple of massive signings that were announced on Sunday. So OpTic announces that they signed both PRED and Kenny to the roster to join with Drazah and Shotzi. So these are obviously really big signings. PRED had been rumored to join OpTic for a long time, and it was sort of clear that that was his intention to do so. There was a lot of drama going on last season where OpTic tried to trade for him amongst their roster problems throughout the season. So ultimately this was sort of a foregone conclusion at this point. But Kenny is honestly more interesting to talk about here in this situation. Quickly, Drazah was extended at the end of last season, and Shotzi's option was extended. He was on a 2+1, so I believe this is the second year of that deal. But moving back to talk about Kenny, it was very interesting because the rumors for this roster were potentially Envoy and Drazah joining, and ultimately when it was clear that Envoy was going to be going to Toronto, we'll talk about him. But I think that Drazah would have been a good fit for this team. They definitely needed a flex, so a lot of that made sense. He ultimately ended up going in a different direction as well, and I think once Kenny saw that opportunity, he obviously reached out and definitely would be a good fit for this team to bring some of that winning culture to the team, and I feel like this is just a really vibey squad, and I think that they're going to be able to accomplish a lot and probably even win a major or champs this year. It'll be very exciting. It's a really hype roster, and I think a lot of the OpTic fans, including myself, are really happy with the team that they ended up here after a pretty tumultuous and challenging year with Scump retiring and everything else in between. The next squad that we're going to talk about is the Atlanta FaZe. So the first thing to address here, obviously the core three stay together. Abizi and Simp, the Tiny Terrors. Their options were extended, as well as Celium, three of the better players in the league. This obviously makes sense, and it's clear that they wanted to stick together. The player that they end up picking up here to replace Slasher, yes, they did win a championship, but ultimately I think they felt like they were never able to really reach the peak that they were expecting here, so they end up bringing in Drazah as their flex. He talked about how he got offers from both OpTic and FaZe, and ultimately weighed out the decision to make, ultimately sort of based on winning. Can't really blame him too much for that decision. Obviously, Atlanta FaZe has been incredibly consistent over the last few years since the CDL started, so he'll definitely be a great addition to this team and bring a lot of the S&D prowess that Slasher brought. A little bit faster pace. So in accordance with this, Celium is going to be going to the main AR, so it'll be interesting to see how that ends up working out. And their coach, Crowder, actually was quoted saying this is more of a risky move, and it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, it's a little bit of a different personality, but I think that he's really going to mesh well with this team, push them to the next level. And the risk, I think, in general is just sort of talking about the roster fit, as well as moving Celium to the main AR. He'll have to take up some more of the responsibilities, like getting more hill time, rotating. Obviously, a lot of players are going to be doing these things, but a lot of the focus is going to be put on him to be making the correct plays a lot of the time, which I wouldn't say that he doesn't make correct plays, but We all know how Celium likes to play. He likes to get kills, sit on headies. So hopefully he'll be able to transition his game, which really shouldn't be too hard for one of the more talented players in the league. But if you're a FaZe fan, got to be really happy about this, and probably one of the better signings among many. Obviously, a lot of these that we're talking about here are some of the best ones, and obviously the best players. So good on Atlanta FaZe. The next team that we're going to talk about here, a spicy one, a spicy pepper emoji tactical rab, is the New York Subliners. So they extend their options on both Hydra and Skies. Makes a lot of sense. Obviously, this team won champs this past season, so it makes sense that they're going to try and stick together. Kismet was an unrestricted free agent, so they re-signed him, but really interesting, they actually decided to not bring back Priesta. So, they won champs. It's not really very common, and I don't believe it's ever been a thing where a team has won champs and split up. But the rumored move that they're going to look to make is to bring in Sib, who has a ton of gun skill and brings a lot to the table in terms of slaying. And I think this team just ultimately was looking to pack a punch. This was sort of rumored after some of the other moves for some of the other top teams were rumored, so I think they might have felt the pressure to also make some changes and try and improve the roster the best that they can to sort of keep up with some of these top teams and continue to be a contender this year as well. Not that they wouldn't have been with that current roster, but I think they just thought that it was the right move ultimately to make that decision, and this has not yet been announced. Obviously, it's just a rumor, but at this point, letting Priesta go and him signing somewhere else, we'll obviously talk about him in a minute, but it has to basically be a done deal with Sib, and they're just waiting to announce it. Similar to how OpTic was, his team's been set and rumored, but this hadn't been announced, so curious to see what ends up happening there in terms of the timing on it, but it's a big gamble, and we're going to have to see if that pays off for the Subliners. The next team to talk about here is the Toronto Ultra. They make arguably the best acquisition of Rostermania. Definitely up there with both Drazah and probably PRED. But pretty interesting one here. We'll go through it. The Toronto Ultra end up picking up options for Scrappy, who was on a 2+1, Kleenex, and Insight. So they keep those core three, and they end up moving on from Hixie, who came in the middle of the year, helped them win a championship, and bring them back to a couple of other finals, including in the World Championship. But they end up bringing in Envoy, a really great SMG to be able to pair with Kleenex. This is a clear pack-a-punch, and on paper might make them the best team in the league if they're able to stay consistent, depending on how Envoy and Kleenex sort of play off each other, which I think will be really well. And the reason that it was so interesting, who knows where this came from, but it was rumored that Toronto Ultra was potentially going through some financial troubles, and they were looking to potentially offload some players in order to get some capital back. And obviously that didn't end up happening, so I'm not sure if that was some sort of negotiation tactic or anything with some of their current players, or that could have came from the parent org as well. And sort of once Scrappy heard news of that, he absolutely shut that down. Scrappy, obviously rookie of the year and one of the best young and up and coming talents in the Call of Duty League. So pretty unclear what happened with that. We'll probably never end up finding out sort of the angle behind that, but certainly they did not split up, and they made a really clear pack-a-punch here with a significant investment here in Envoy. This is going to be a really tough team to beat, and can't wait to see a bunch of these top teams clashing to start the year. Finally, the last team we're going to talk about individually here is the Boston Breach, and they definitely made a ton of roster moves at the end of the year last year, and our team that is willing to go for it, and they want to be one of these contending teams and sort of break the ceiling into the top echelon of teams. But as a result of Priesta not signing with the New York Subliners again, they end up picking him up as well as Slasher. So that'll be your main and Slasher, and your flex and Priesta. It was rumored that these two were a duo, but I think it makes a lot of sense for these two guys to stick together. Slasher, I know, wants to play with some more experience and older players, and Priesta's, been around in the league a long time and, won many tournaments in the CDL and prior. So I think this makes a lot of sense, and definitely a great move by Boston to bring both of these veteran ARs into the team. Talking about their SMGs, Snoopy was, I think, re-signed. It's kind of weird because he was on the Challenger team, came up to only play in Call of Duty Champs, so, the wording might be a little weird there, but I just put Snoopy re-signed. A very talented young SMG with great movement, plays at a very fast pace. I think that's going to pair very well with Capsule, and he was on the Boston Breach 2 years ago in Vanguard, and I think this makes a lot of sense. Capsule played really well to end the season. This past year, Florida just couldn't really get everything together on the same page until the end of the year, sort of ran out of time in order to get into Champs, but I think these two play at a very similar pace, and I think with the guidance of Slasher and Priesta, I think this team is going to be able to put together a really good system and might be on the fringe of one of the top teams. Obviously, I think the top four are pretty solidified, the first four that I talked about, but this team has a lot of upside depending on what Snoopy and Capsule are able to bring to the SMG role. Definitely a little bit of a more odd team. I'm not sure exactly how the fit will be in terms of team chemistry, but I think this team has a lot of talent, and I think the blueprint is there for them to have a pretty successful season compared to the few seasons of the past. A couple of other notes on Rostermania. The first one I'll talk about is where will the Los Angeles Thieves pivot to. Obviously, they had Sam Octane retire this past season after Champs. Drazah goes on to the Atlanta FaZe, Envoy to Toronto, Kenny to OpTic. They have a full clean slate here. There are some different rumored rosters, but haven't really heard anything too solid on them. So a lot of it, centered around a young talent with upside. We'll talk about some of the players as well after this that are still on the market, but it'll be pretty interesting what they end up doing. I think that a lot of challenger players may get a shot this year, just depending on teams obviously wanting to cut out spending this year as they have in years past, and I think a lot of these players would be willing for an opportunity to play on LAT and, be a part of the league. Obviously a great organization, so could see a lot of challenger guys, could see a lot of younger guys. Curious to see ultimately what may happen with this team. Obviously JCap and Shane are still there as their coaches, and I think they'll be able to build a solid system, and they'll have a pretty good pick of the run when it comes to some of the players that are still left as a result of the top team sort of shuffling out over the past few weeks. The next team to talk about is the Seattle Surge. They're rumored to have signed Rambo Ray to be the head coach of their squad, and the question is, who will he build this roster around? Surge at this point doesn't have any other players under contract, with PRED going to OpTic, Sib rumored to be going to NYSL. Everybody is a free agent as well, but Lamar Accuracy, their main, was not picked back up yet, and neither is Mac. And I think Mac has a lot of talent, so we'll see if they look to try and retain him. But I think that he could be a big piece for sure in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. So not exactly sure what the Seattle Surge will end up doing, but bringing in Rambo definitely brings a little bit of a hint of what we're looking at, just the way that he coaches and has done so in the past, more of a traditional, old school Call of Duty style. So curious to see what this organization is going to look to do. The next note is just which team is going to blink next. Again, a lot of the top teams have already sort of played their hands, and it's now on the remaining teams to try and sift through the players, figure out who they think has a lot of upside, who's going to be a good fit, maybe with some of their current players, as well as, if you're a clean squad, just ultimately what you're looking to build around and ultimately how you're looking for your team to play. So it'll be curious which team. Obviously, Los Angeles Thieves are still there. Surge, Minnesota Rocker are probably the next three big players that haven't solidified their roster just quite yet. So we'll be curious to see who ends up sort of making their announcement next and taking a step, hopefully in the right direction by announcing their team and having the opportunity to build chemistry, get together, and build out a system that they think will be successful. And the last thing, just plenty of upside players left. There's still a ton of players that have been in the league in the past, players that were on teams this past year that played well, and tons of top challenger players that I think are looking to break in and have their shot in the CDL. So we'll go through and we'll talk about some of these players, but just wanted to note, obviously a lot of the top teams have already signed people, but there's tons of great players left, and ultimately I think there's still one or two teams that are going to be able to build out that can really be competitive in the mid-pack on their event. Obviously it's Call of Duty, it's a video game, anybody can win on their day, so I think there's still plenty of players to be able to build teams around that can be somewhat competitive next season. The last thing we're going to talk about is just some key players to target. And I sort of broke it down by position about some of the players. These are mainly guys that were all in the league last year just because I'm not super familiar with challengers and what opportunities may look like from that perspective. But we'll start here with the main ARs. We have Clayster, who had a great year for the Vegas Legion. Him and Dan Ghosty, who was a rookie picked up by OpTic last year, I think are probably the top two targets here. And these guys may even pair up because I think Dan Ghosty can play the flex as well, but I just put him down as a main here just as a result of his in-game leadership stuff, his communication. I think he would fit either role well, but I think these guys are probably the top two main AR targets. We also have Donnie Temp, who was on Vegas Legion, played well. Cammy had an up and down year, but I think everybody's just going to continue to chase that high that Cammy had in Cold War. Little ESPN notification for my my fantasy baseball. But also Abuza, he's the only challenger player that I have on here as a main AR. He's probably the best challenger player and I think should definitely get an opportunity in the league. Just to wrap up the main ARs, we have Alec Aristides and Lamar Accuracy. Moving on to talk about the flexes, we have Awakening, Attach, Nasty, Illy. I think that's sort of the top echelon here. You know, Illy, we're not even sure what is going to end up happening with him. Obviously did not play too much this year after the whole OpTic Texas situation going on. And also just have to mention Beans and Brack. Both players had some pretty exciting points throughout the season. Beans playing well in multiple different events. I think Brack is a pretty underrated AR player that was on Florida team that really had trouble figuring it out until the end of the year, so definitely some interesting upside. The other one is Nasty, obviously being on London. The team really did not play well, but his numbers the last 2 years have been really good individually, and curious to see what system he would sort of fit into and see if they're able to get the maximum amount out of his potential. Moving on to some of our subs. These are going to be mainly Slayers. And the first guy to talk about, the top tier here, I would say Standy, Joe Deceives, and Afro. I think these are mainly the high upside guys. Standy on Toronto gets dropped. He's on Vegas. He plays well for them. Joe Deceives, just a really tough year with LAG and tons of things going on in their camp. I think that he's a great young player with tons of upside. If put in the right system. And Afro, he was a high-valued guy going over to the Minnesota Rocker last year. And I don't know if it was the situation or what it was, but he had a couple of really good stages and then a couple of more poor ones where the team overall didn't perform well at all either. But I think his stock is still really high and could definitely make an impact on a lot of rosters. But a few other Slayer subs that I wanted to throw in here. TJ Haley is an incredible S&D player. Bance, very similar to Afro, up and down year on the Minnesota Rocker. Similar with Fame, also on the Minnesota Rocker. They put him on the AR. That really wasn't the position that he plays. He went over to sub, ended up playing really well. So I might put him up there in the top tier as well, behind Afro. We also have Havoc, and another guy to talk about is Mac, who I think has a ton of potential, like we talked about when talking about the Seattle Surge. And finally, we'll talk about some entry subs, guys that play incredibly fast. These guys to highlight, I think the top tier is just sort of Nero and Hook. I think that it's kind of interesting the way that this role has evolved. These are just a couple of the top guys that I saw, and there will definitely be other people filling this role or ultimately, trying to adopt this playstyle, but Nero and Hook are probably the top two here for me. A lot of Boston guys in here, Vivid, Kremp, Exceed from LAG, and ASIM, who had a tough year on London, but obviously he's played well in years past and played well in stages this year, but the team overall wasn't able to put it together. But overall, these are just some of the players that I think should be targeted by some of these organizations and are high-impact guys that can still fill out, like I'd mentioned, 1 to 2 more competitive rosters to be able to compete in the mid-pack. But that's going to do it for this video, guys. Let me know down in the comment section below what teams you would build with some of the players remaining, maybe from this list, maybe from challengers. Curious to see your guys' opinions. And ultimately, who you guys think is the best team. A lot of the top teams have made their moves and played their hand, and can't wait for the season to start back up and these teams to start clashing. But that's going to do it for me, guys. This has been your boy Frankie Bones, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Peace out.